Why are some Old Testament laws not considered to be binding on the believer? That's really an outstanding question. And the answer is one that has been wrestled over since the days of the early church. The vast majority of major issues that the church had to deal with in the first century were issues relating to whether or not circumcision was required for Gentile believers, and related to that the rest of what we would call the ceremonial law. And the disciples, the apostles rather, and the Jerusalem council came down with their decision saying, no, it's not necessary for unbelievers to obey the ceremonial law. Theologians over the years have distinguished among three different types of laws in the Old Testament, or specifically the law given to the nation of Israel. One is what we call the civil law. This is the law for the government. When God lists out things which are capital offenses, this is a law that the government in Israel is expected to abide by. That's a civil law. The ceremonial law has to do with sacraments, sacrifices, and things of that nature. And then there's also the moral law, which just has to do with right and wrong. Well, it's become quite popular among unbelievers to try to embarrass Christians because of some of these things that are written about in the Old Testament law and that are given from the hand of God. And sadly, too often, many Christians have just sort of been embarrassed as well, been ashamed of God's own law. It's not what we're called to do. We're called to understand, at the very least, our obligation to submit to the moral law of God. When God gives a law against, for instance, coveting in the 10th commandment to the children of Israel, there's nothing about the coming of Jesus, nothing about the fact that we're Gentiles and not Jews, that says you guys are allowed to covet. Of course we're not. This is a bad thing. This is an unhealthy thing. But that law that says you got to circumcise your sons on the 8th day is not a part of the law that we're required to keep. Again, expressly denied by the apostles in the New Covenant. With respect to the civil law, there is debate about exactly how and if we are to follow the pattern God established for Israel. And the reality is there's a profound sense of justice in that law, and when we're ashamed of it, then we're showing our own sinfulness, I would argue. Well, that's all well and good, but the difficulty is that the Bible doesn't come color-coded. It doesn't say, oh, by the way, this is a ceremonial law. Oh, by the way, this is a civil law. Oftentimes, it's pretty clear. As I said, if the end of the law is, if you break this, you should be put to death, it's a pretty good chance that that's a civil law. There's a pretty good chance that if it involves, at the end of it, a killing of an animal, then it's probably going to be ceremonial. Well, but we don't always know. Consider, for instance, the kosher laws. There is again, people would make fun of the idea that God's law says you can't eat shellfish. Well, now we do eat shellfish, and most of us don't feel the least bit bad about it. Does that mean we don't care about God's law? Or there's a law against mixing cotton and wool in the same cloth. Well, whether or not that's a moral law or a ceremonial law is something we have to wrestle over, and there are disagreements about it. But what I want us to do, given our short amount of time, is to remember that the fact that the law may change in differing circumstances doesn't mean that God has changed. It doesn't mean that righteousness has changed. It means that circumstances have changed. Jesus has come. Everything that pointed toward him, to go back to it, would be to deny that he has come. So don't get too uptight about this. Now, in our remaining seconds, let me ask you to please consider sending in a question or an objection to something you've heard. I want, as much as possible, for these to be conversations. You can email any questions you might have that you'd like me to look at, or any objections that you have. You can email those to hellorcjr@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you like, what you don't like about the podcast, what you'd like to see changed, or again, any questions you may have that you'd like us to take a look at. Thanks so much.